There is an activity so common, so constant, and so silent that few people realize how much it interferes with the energy state they sustain daily. It requires no physical effort, makes no sound, and is not visible. Yet, it consumes a significant portion of vital energy. Thinking too much has become normalized, even romanticized. But thinking, when not observed, becomes a continuous stream that fragments attention, speeds up the internal system, and begins to distort the perception of reality. In many cases, the impact of this process isn't even consciously noticed, because it doesn't manifest as a direct symptom, but rather as a subtle energetic and vibrational block. Our energy field doesn't respond only to external actions. It responds above all to the quality of the information circulating internally. And when that information builds up without pause, in other words, when thought becomes noise, it creates a vibrational overload that disrupts the field. This interference may not seem obvious at first glance, but it shows up as mental fatigue, difficulty staying present, and a sense of mismatch between what one seeks and what one experiences. In many spiritual traditions, the mind is described as a tool, useful, necessary, but dangerous when it takes control. Because thought, when not recognized as passing content, becomes identity, and that's when it stops being neutral. And the more identified one is with their own thoughts, the harder it becomes to notice that there's something beyond them. Excessive thinking doesn't just cause confusion. It fragments the field, alters the vibration, and makes it harder to access higher levels of clarity, perception, and magnetism. And the more one tries to solve this by thinking even more, the more the field shuts down. The mind insists on occupying all the space, but it's space that sustains true transformation, not space in time, nor physical space, but inner space. And because of that, there's no pause between one thought and the next. There's no recognition that not every mental content needs to be followed. Understanding how overthinking affects the energy field is an essential step on the path of self-knowledge. Because reorganizing your vibration doesn't depend on controlling the world or even controlling the mind. It depends on realizing how much the mind has been running on autopilot. And when that excess is brought to consciousness, something important begins to shift. Thinking is one of the mind's most basic functions, but most people have never asked themselves what thought actually is. It's through thought that decisions are made, experiences are interpreted, and realities are built. On the surface, it seems like just a sequence of ideas, images, words, evaluations, memories, or projections. But when you observe more closely, it becomes clear that thinking doesn't happen by direct choice. It happens by pattern. They are not created, they are repeated. They come from records, from memories, from old interpretations. And what's most surprising is that this repetition happens all the time. The mind has been trained to function like a constant surveillance system. It analyzes, compares, judges, and predicts. And it does this even when there is no real threat, no problem to solve. The activity continues, out of habit, conditioning, or impulse. This automatic movement of the mind creates an internal environment where thought is no longer a tool, but an uninterrupted flow of noise. And the more continuous this noise becomes, the more it starts to be confused with perception itself. Many times it's impossible to distinguish thought from reality. What's actually perceived is a mental interpretation, an image distorted by what has already been lived, what is feared, or what is expected. And that's where energetic interference begins, because this noise, far from being harmless, emits a constant vibration that begins to affect the surrounding energy field. All mental activity has a frequency, and that frequency influences how energy flows through the body, the field, and our interaction with the world. Fast thoughts create unstable fields, Repetitive thoughts generate dense fields, and negative thoughts fragment the structure of the field. The more intense the mental activity, the less space there is for perception, intuition, and higher states of presence. And even seemingly neutral thoughts like daily tasks, routine concerns, or simple reflections, when repeated excessively, create a vibrational information overload that prevents the field from staying in harmony. Clearly, it's not about eliminating thought or judging it. It's about understanding the role it's playing. Because when thought is no longer used consciously, it begins to use the person carrying it. And the mind, in that state, doesn't observe. It just reacts. It anticipates, responds, retrieves old data, and projects it onto the now. And this pattern is so old, so familiar, that it's rarely questioned. But just because it's familiar doesn't mean it's natural. And just because it feels inevitable doesn't mean it has to continue. Mental repetition is not a reflection of the present, but of the past. And that's exactly why overthinking doesn't just delay personal growth. It disconnects you from the real experience. Because when the mind is too busy interpreting what's happening, it can't actually be present in what's happening. And as a result, the vibrational field doesn't align with the now. It resonates with fragments of what has already been lived, and that makes it unstable, reactive, and blocked. It's impossible to access inner clarity when the inner space is saturated with noise. And that's why the first step to restoring energy isn't thinking differently. It's noticing how much you're thinking without realizing it. When that becomes visible, the process of reorganization begins. The energy field comes before words, before thoughts, and even before action. It is dynamic and directly influences how we feel, how we perceive the environment around us, and how events seem to unfold in our lives. In most spiritual traditions, this field is seen as a vibrational extension of consciousness. And although it cannot be measured with common instruments, it can be directly perceived by those who develop sensitivity. The energy field carries information, and that information doesn't come only from the physical body, but also from the mind, the emotions, and mainly from the quality of the inner states that are repeated over time. Each person emits a frequency. This frequency is not fixed. It changes, adjusts, intensifies, or weakens depending on what is happening internally. And this is exactly where thought begins to play a decisive role. The field does not respond only to what is lived. It responds mainly to what is maintained inside the mind, what is frequently thought, what is internally replayed, what is not released. Recurring thoughts act like small signal transmitters. So the more the same mental content is repeated, the more that content becomes solidified as an energetic pattern. And the more solid that pattern becomes, the more it shapes the experiences that manifest. That's why certain situations repeat. That's why, even after changing environments or routines, some sensations keep coming back. Because the field is not fueled only by what we do, but by what we sustain internally with the most consistency. And thoughts, especially the unconscious, repetitive, and reactive ones, carry more vibrational weight than we realize. Constant thinking acts as a kind of subtle blockage. It interferes with the flow of the field, creates noise in the more sensitive perceptions, and begins to attract experiences that resonate with the vibration it emits. A field overloaded with compulsive thoughts tends to become dense, fragmented, and unstable. This instability is not visible, but it can be felt. It shows up as irritation without an apparent cause, lack of focus, confusing sensations, or a kind of disconnection between what is desired and what is lived. In more harmonious states, the field flows. There is a sense of lightness, clarity, and coherence between intention and reality. But when there is excess thought, this flow is replaced by resistance, as if something is always blocking the experience. The quality of the energy we emit directly impacts the types of situations, people, and paths we come into contact with. And this quality is deeply linked to how we deal with our own thoughts. Fast, disorganized, or tension-filled thoughts create interference, not only internally, but also externally. The energy becomes reactive and the field loses coherence. And with that, it also loses the ability to attract aligned experiences. Basically, what vibrates manifests. And if what vibrates comes from the mind, then the way you think becomes one of the most active forces in the process of manifesting your own reality. One of the main causes of overthinking doesn't lie in the content of the mind, but in identification with it. The problem isn't having thoughts. It's believing those thoughts are who you are. This is the root of internal overload, because the mind doesn't just think. It gets confused with what it thinks. Most people have never realized that there is a difference between what we think and what we are. When a thought appears, it's automatically assumed to be true, necessary, part of a fixed identity. And from there, a cycle is formed. The thought generates an emotion, the emotion reinforces the thought, and the energy field responds to that pattern as if it were reality. But thought is not identity. It's just content that passes, repeats, and changes. The consciousness that observes the thoughts, on the other hand, is stable, and it's precisely this capacity to observe that breaks the cycle of identification. Without this space of observation, the mind takes control of the experience. If a thought of insecurity arises, it's not just seen, it's lived as if it were true. If a doubt appears, it's not questioned, just felt as a warning, and this becomes the dominant field. After all, vibration responds to content, not to objective reality. This identification is subtle but powerful. It builds a layer where everything that passes through the mind is absorbed as part of the self. And with that, the energy field begins to vibrate reactively, not based on consciousness, but based on the mental narrative being replayed in that moment. How many of your thoughts do you believe actually arise from the present moment? And how many are just reflections of what's already been lived or what you fear might happen? The energy field doesn't distinguish between what is present and what is memory. It responds to what is active. And if what's active are automatic, conditioned, and unconscious thoughts, then that's the vibration that becomes dominant, even if the external environment doesn't justify it. That's why presence is so important to break the cycle. It's necessary to recognize that thoughts exist, but so does someone who observes them. That someone doesn't need to react. They simply perceive. And it's this perception that begins to dissolve the rigid structure of thought as identity. When consciousness takes the position of observer, the mind loses power. The thoughts don't disappear, but they become lighter, less urgent, less true. When thoughts aren't observed, expressed, or understood, they remain active, not in the conscious field, but in the energy field. Thought doesn't end when it arises. It leaves a mark. And when repeated frequently, that mark becomes a pattern. That pattern, in turn, begins to operate automatically, influencing the vibrational state even when the content is no longer consciously present. This is how mental accumulation forms. Recurring thoughts, fueled by unconscious interpretations and past experiences, become fixed as subtle vibrational structures, and these structures stay active until they are seen. Many times, what feels like emotional weight, resistance, or inner instability is the direct effect of old thoughts still alive in the energy field. And most of the time, these thoughts weren't even created intentionally. Many of them are inherited, absorbed, or even copied. They're mental forms that come from family narratives, social conditioning, childhood experiences, or even from the surrounding collective. This means that not every thought you carry was chosen, but if it repeats inside you, it shapes your field. And if it shapes your field, it also shapes the way you experience reality. As we saw before, a field overloaded with accumulated thoughts tends to vibrate in a fragmented, dense, and repetitive way. And as a consequence, it attracts situations that mirror that density. That's why it's common to feel stuck in the same cycles, even after trying to change behaviors or environments. The mind tries to solve these patterns with more thought, seeking explanations, justifications, strategies. But mental accumulation doesn't dissolve through cognitive effort. It dissolves through consciousness. When a thought is observed clearly and without judgment, it loses strength. And when it loses strength, it starts to release from the field. It's the lack of involvement that undoes the fixation. That's why the practice is not to eliminate thoughts. It's to interrupt the impulse to get lost in them. Because the more a mental narrative is fed, the more it becomes fixed energetically. What's in the field only loses strength when it's no longer being fueled. And the first step for that to happen is to notice what is being sustained and how much of it has been carried out of habit, repetition, or simply because it was never questioned. So, to reorganize the field, it's necessary to recognize what is taking up space. And to recognize it, you have to observe. Because only what you're willing to see becomes visible. One of the biggest misconceptions on the path of internal reorganization is believing that the goal is to stop thinking. This idea in itself already creates tension, because the more someone tries not to think, the more they become trapped in the effort to control what happens inside the mind. And control, in this case, doesn't lead to freedom. It leads to conflict. Thought does not need to be forcibly stopped. It simply needs to stop being the center of the experience. When we talk about silencing the mind, we're not talking about making the mind disappear. What we seek is not total absence of thought, but the creation of a space where thoughts can arise without taking over. It's an internal shift, moving from the place of one who is entangled in the mind's content to the place of one who observes that content without getting lost in it. So the point here is not to stop the movement, but to change the relationship with it. When that relationship changes, the inner experience transforms. Thought still exists, but it no longer fills the whole space. It doesn't define the moment. It just passes, like any other phenomenon. Inner silence manifests when there is a radical change in the way thought is experienced. What quiets the mind is not the attempt to suppress mental content, but the ability to recognize thought as a temporary phenomenon. When that recognition stabilizes, thought no longer creates inner friction, and the energy field stops responding as if every mental content were a threat or an immediate call to action. In this state, emotional involvement with thoughts begins to dissolve. The mind continues to function, but it no longer demands constant attention. The noise loses urgency, and the impulse to react weakens. And in this space of non-involvement, the ability to simply perceive arises. And perceiving without reacting is what, energetically, sets you free. This kind of silence happens naturally when there is enough awareness to interrupt the cycle of identification. Because what sustains the noise is the habit of following every thought as if it had absolute value. And what dissolves it is clear, direct, and unresisting observation. This inner release is not just psychological. It's a shift in frequency. The energy field responds immediately when the system stops operating in reactive mode. Energy starts flowing again. Areas of tension begin to release. The nervous system slows down, and consciousness, freed from excess noise, can finally occupy the space that was being monopolized by the mind. It's in this space, occupied by consciousness, where there is no conflict, excess, or resistance, that the state many know as flow emerges. Flow is what happens when there is no friction between who you are, what you're doing, and the present moment. It's when internal movement and external movement fall into sync, without conscious effort, without constant analysis, without mental interruption. It's a natural fusion between action and perception, where everything flows with lightness and direction. Contrary to what many believe, the state of flow doesn't depend on a specific activity. It's not limited to art, sports, or creation. It can emerge in any situation where the mind stops interfering and consciousness takes the lead. What all these experiences have in common is the release of mental control. After all, flow doesn't come from control. It comes from conscious surrender to what is happening, without the fragmentation produced by excessive thinking. Energetically, this state is highly coherent, causing the vibrational field to reorganize naturally, without effort. Energy flows more freely. There's more vitality, more clarity, and an expanded perception of reality. What once felt heavy or stuck starts to move. Intuition becomes more accessible. Synchronicity becomes more frequent. And the experience of being becomes lighter, not because thoughts have completely ceased, but because they no longer take up all the inner space. In the state of flow, the mind keeps working, but not as noise. It works as support. Thoughts arise, but they don't interrupt. Decisions are made, but they don't require effort. The body responds intelligently. Time seems to slow down. And the feeling is of being exactly where you're supposed to be, without needing to justify or question it. This alignment arises when the field is clear enough to allow energy to follow its natural course. And for that to happen, excessive thinking needs to be put in its rightful place. This is the point where the field stops reacting to mental patterns and starts responding to consciousness. And it's in this more coherent state that it becomes possible to access higher levels of perception and clarity. But to sustain this vibration consistently, it takes more than occasional moments of presence. It takes a commitment to your own frequency. What sustains this new frequency is not the environment, nor the result of something achieved in the future. It grows stronger through the way each moment is inhabited. And the foundation for this is always the same, the way you respond to your own mental movement. To observe is not to think about the thought. It's not to reason about the mind or build explanations around it. To observe is a direct, neutral, and present act. It involves seeing the thought arise and, instead of following it or resisting it, allowing it to exist without turning it into action, reaction, or identification. This kind of observation creates a real internal space that can be felt. A subtle relief, as if something inside gently expands. Consciousness, when not absorbed by thoughts, begins to act as a kind of vibrational stabilizer. It's as if the field, once reactive, can finally enter coherence, not through force, but through the absence of conflict. Creating this space requires intention and continuity. It's a daily practice, silent, often imperceptible externally, but extremely powerful in its internal effects. Each moment of conscious observation reduces the power of automatic mental patterns. And as this practice becomes consistent, the nervous system responds, the body relaxes, perception expands, and the field begins to reflect a different frequency. For this, it's not necessary to abandon daily life or adopt complex rituals. What's essential isn't in the practice itself, but in the quality of attention. Meditating for a few minutes, walking with total presence, breathing consciously while observing thoughts. All of these are ways to cultivate this inner state. But no technique is more powerful than the simple act of pausing, observing, and choosing. Because there is always a choice. The choice to stay inside the mental flow or to reposition yourself as the observer. The choice to feed a thought or let it pass. The choice to react as usual or to notice the impulse before it becomes action. These small choices, repeated with awareness, shift the base frequency of experience. They don't just change what you feel, they change what you emit. and the energy field begins to adapt to this new information. What was once automatic becomes optional. What was unquestionable starts to be seen with more clarity, and the clearer the perception, the lighter the field becomes. Presence stops being an effort and starts becoming a natural state. And it is precisely in this more spacious and coherent state that a frequency emerges, different from the one sustained by old mental patterns. The coherence we speak of here is not just an energetic concept. It's a noticeable quality in the way life flows. Situations begin to align more easily. Communication becomes clearer. Decisions require less effort. There's a kind of order that sets in, precisely because the internal frequency is no longer in conflict. This new state is not based on eliminating thoughts, but on dissolving the struggle against them. And when the struggle ends, the energy that was once used to control, resist, or suppress becomes available again. That energetic release in itself is enough to change a person's vibration. The body feels lighter. Breathing adjusts naturally. Intuition becomes sharper, and the field starts working as it should, receptive, stable, connected. It's common that, at this stage, spontaneous insights arise, not as answers that were searched for, but as natural perceptions that emerge from silence. This happens because the space created by observation allows other layers of consciousness to express themselves. Layers that were hidden beneath the mental noise and now find a field ready to reveal them. This new frequency doesn't need to be forced. It arises as a reflection of the quality of presence that sets in when the mind no longer dictates the rhythm of experience. The need for control gives way to trust. The anxiety for the future dissolves in the clarity of now. And with this internal stability, external reality tends to respond differently. Not because the world has changed, but because the vibration you interact with it has. The most important thing is to understand that this new frequency doesn't depend on a specific emotional state. You don't have to feel positive all the time. What sustains vibrational coherence is clarity, the ability to notice internal movements without getting lost in them. When there's clarity, even challenging emotions don't disrupt the field. They pass. They're recognized, processed, and released. And that's the process that allows energy to keep flowing without crystallizing into reactive patterns. The field, when free from the struggle with the mind, becomes a purer reflection of consciousness. It stops echoing old patterns and starts expressing something more aligned with the intelligence of the present. And when that vibration stabilizes, the experience of reality changes, not as a mystical event, but as the direct consequence of a deep internal reorganization. It's from this more stable vibrational foundation that it becomes possible to live with more clarity, more flow, and more integrity. But this stability doesn't sustain itself alone. It needs care, attention, and a specific kind of responsibility. The responsibility to keep the field clean, observable, and open to what is alive in the now. Living in this alignment doesn't mean having total control over what you think or feel. It simply means knowing where to remain. And remaining in the consciousness that observes is what keeps the energy organized. Because thoughts will come, emotions will move, impulses will arise. But the consciousness that sees all of this doesn't need to be dragged along. It is the point of stability, the place from which life can be lived without distortion. In the end, transformation doesn't lie in changing the mind. It lies in no longer giving it a power it never needed to have. And when that silent place begins to be recognized as the most stable point of experience, everything around you begins to reorganize, not by chance, but because now there's finally enough space for it to happen. Thank you for embarking on this journey with me. If this video resonated with you, I invite you to like and subscribe to our channel. Share this video with others so they can benefit from this message. And don't forget to leave a comment below sharing your thoughts, reflections, and experiences. Thanks again for watching and for joining me. Take care and see you soon.